If you've ever tried ripping your media collection so that you could stream it with Plex or Jellyfin, well, you probably know the drill. First, you pop in your disk, fire up MakeMKV, pick the right files, wait for it to rip, import the files into Handbrake, tweak the settings, wait again, properly name everything, move it all to the right folders, update your Plex or Jellyfin library, and then finally you can sit down and enjoy your show or movie. But what if instead you could just do this? Pop in the disk, and then, I don't know, go make a cup of coffee, pet your dog, compete in a home lab challenge with a fellow YouTuber, just live your normal life. And then a bit later you could just turn on your TV and bam, there's your movie ready to go. Well, that's actually possible thanks to something called Automatic Ripping Machine. So, let's talk about it. Now, automating the process of ripping discs is great because it saves me so much time, something I don't seem to have much of these days. Between family and work, trying to find time to exercise or stay active is pretty tough, but fortunately, there's the auto-incline walking treadmill from today's sponsor, FlexiSpot. This thing is perfect for someone like me who spends way too much time at a desk but wants to stay active. And I'll be honest, when I first heard about this, I wasn't all that interested. Mostly just because my space is already cramped enough as it is. But as it turns out, this thing is super easy to move around and store away, which means I can easily stay active while writing scripts, building computers, making a sandwich, or even while filming this ad. It comes with a handy wireless remote that lets you adjust speeds, select one of the 6 preset programs, or adjust one of the 9 different incline levels. Plus, it even has a built-in Bluetooth speaker so you can listen to your favorite music, podcasts, or YouTube videos. And it's easy to hear because, well, this thing's actually fairly quiet. But just because it's small and quiet doesn't mean it's flimsy. It has a 275-pound capacity and comes with a 2-year warranty. So if you're wanting to easily stay active while in the office or when working from home, make sure to check out the auto-incline walking treadmill from FlexiSpot by using my link down in the description below. So to automate this process of ripping discs, we're going to use something called ARM. And actually, no, not this kind of ARM. ARM is an automatic ripping machine. I believe ARM originally started as just a collection of scripts, but has since evolved into an actively maintained open source project. It works by detecting when a CD, DVD, or Blu-ray disc is inserted into an optical drive, automatically launching MakeMKV to rip the content, optionally running Handbrake to transcode the files into an optimized format, and then properly naming and moving them to the correct directory, ensuring seamless integration with media servers like Jellyfin. Now this all sounds great, but does it actually work? Well, yes. And no. There are definitely some quirks and issues with this, but I'll get to those here in a bit. First, let's talk about what all you need to run ARM. I originally planned to run this on this HP ProLiant NAS that I did this complete overhaul on a while back, but because it took me so long to actually get around to doing this video, I've since sort of stolen quite a few adapters and parts from that build, so it's just kind of sitting right up there, looking pretty, but it doesn't really work. So instead, I decided to build a test system in this Antec 300 case, which actually used to be my NAS. This case works really well because it has room for some hard drives, but also has 3 5.25-inch bays for disk drives, which we obviously need. When it comes to DVDs, things are pretty simple. You just need a decent working DVD drive, like this one from Lightscribe that I have here. But if you're trying to rip Blu-rays, in particular Ultra HD or 4K Blu-rays, well, you're probably going to need to flash some firmware to make sure your drive is compatible with something called LibreDrive. Now, I actually covered this in a previous video where I did some DVD and Blu-ray ripping, so I'll link that video down in the description, but I'll also just put the guide that I originally followed down there as well. And here I'm using that same Blu-ray reader from LG that I used in the previous video, but it's a little hard to tell because I've since spray painted it black. Now, along with your working disk drives, you're also going to need some available solid-state storage. Most likely this can just be your boot drive. I say this because you're probably going to want some relatively fast storage for the directories where MakeMKV stores the raw files, and also where it stores the transcoded media while it's using Handbrake. If you're trying to run those directories on spinning disks or on some slower network-attached storage or something like that, you might actually see some slowdowns in the ripping and transcoding process. Now for the final media, you're probably going to want some bulk hard drive storage, or maybe a network attached storage device or something like that. And if you're already running something like Jellyfin or Plex, you can probably just use whatever storage you're using for those libraries. In my test system, I'm using a 1TB NVMe SSD for the boot drive, and then just a couple of 4TB hard drives that I'll use later on for some storage. I'm just using a relatively older motherboard with an Intel i7-9700, but it really doesn't matter what CPU you use. Just be aware that if you use a low-end CPU or a CPU that uses a lot of power, you might end up having longer transcode times or maybe a higher electricity bill. Now you might be wondering, especially if you're a fan of this channel, why I'm not talking about hardware accelerated transcoding. And technically, ARM does support QuickSync for Intel GPUs, GPUs, NVENC for NVIDIA GPUs, and VCE for AMD GPUs, but it also sort of doesn't, but once again, we'll get to that here in a bit. You can install ARM natively onto a Linux operating system, but it's recommended, at least at this point in the development cycle, to just use Docker. Now, if you're watching this video and considering following along and setting up ARM for yourself, you'll probably want to make sure you're familiar with Docker. If you're not, there's plenty of resources online where you can look up what it is and get a basic understanding of what containers are and how to set them up. Because this runs in a container, you can install it just about anywhere, on a server running Unraid, TrueNAS, Portainer, really just any Linux operating system that can run Docker. But for testing things out, I decided to start out with just a plain install of Debian 12. Later on though, I'll show you how I actually set this up in Proxmox in conjunction with TrueNAS and a Jellyfin server. So let's hop over and I'll show you how we can get ARM set up and running. All right, so over here I'm SSH'd into my machine that's running Debian 12. Over here I have the install instructions on the ARM GitHub. Now really quick, this isn't going to be like a full guide on how to install Debian 12 and how to install Docker. This video would get way too long if I tried to do that. You're going to have some prerequisite knowledge of Docker and Linux coming into this, but I can at least kind of show you my process of how I got it installed, how I got it running, and some of the issues I ran into. Okay, now over here in the ARM instructions, there actually is a link to just the Docker image on Docker Hub, and you could just copy this Docker run command and get going if you kind of know what you're doing. But there's also this helpful script they have if you're running this on Debian or Ubuntu or whatever. So I already ran this apt install wget and lsscsi, so we can actually just type in lsscsi-g. And here I had this text zoomed in, but you can see we have our SSD, but then we also have these two drives here, our Blu-ray drive and then our DVD drive, which are /dev SR0 and SR1, which that's just helpful to know because we're gonna need to pass those through to the Docker container. Now this second script here, we can go ahead and get that. And all this script is going to do is it's going to create an ARM user and group if they don't already exist. It's going to install Docker if it's not already on the system. It's going to pull the image and then create these mount points for any DVD drives found on the system. Now, if you have a basic understanding of Docker and user permissions and stuff, you don't need to run this script, but it does make things a little bit helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Okay, great. So if I go to list home/ARM, we can see we have this start ARM container.sh. And if we edit that, we'll see we have a few things here. We have the port, which we'll just keep at 8080. We have this ARM user and group, which we'll need to set that up. And then we have quite a few directories we need to set up. And then we have our devices for our DVD drives, which we'll need to edit those as well. And the only thing else we need to change is the CPU pinning down here, which is optional. I like to keep like a core at least available to the host operating system. That way, if it's transcoding, the whole system doesn't bog down. And I actually already edited this to just 2 through 7. I have an 8-core CPU, so I wanted to keep cores 0 and 1 available. And then 2 through 7 can be available for the Docker container. That's going to depend on your CPU, but if you're curious, you can type in lscpu and then -AE, and that should list out all of your CPUs and which core they belong to, and you can look up CPU pinning or CPU affinity if you're curious. Now for the user and group ID, we can just type in ID-U for user, and then ARM, and we get 1001, and we can do the same thing with G for group, and we also get 1001. So we can actually go back into our container here, and we can edit those values, and replace this with 1001 and 1001. And if you're familiar with Docker and permissions, this really doesn't matter. You just need to make sure that whatever user you provide here has permissions to the folders we're about to create. And as you can see here, we need one folder that's just /home/ARM, which should be pretty easy. And then we need a music folder, logs, media, and config. So we already have our /home/ARM, but we need to make a few more directories. So we can do make directory, media, music, logs, and config. If we list this out, we can actually see that all of these folders are owned by root, so we can fix that by typing in chown, C-H-O-N, I really don't know how to say it, -R, and then ARM, and we'll just do everything in this folder. And now this should all be owned by ARM, which fixes any permissions issues. Now another thing we can type in again is that lsscsi to make sure we have our 2 disk readers, which are mounted at /dev/SR0 and SR1 like we saw earlier. So now we can go back to our little Docker run command, and we can fix these paths. So this should be pretty easy. We can just we'll set that up to /home/ARM. Here we'll do the same thing, but /home/ARM/music, and you get the gist. Okay, and then down here we don't need this SR3 or SR2, so we can just get rid of those. And then everything else looks good, so we should be able to exit out of this or save it. And now we can actually run this script, which is just that Docker run command. And if we type in Docker PS, we can see that this is up and it looks healthy. So if we actually hop over to that IP address on port 8080, oh gosh, we're gonna switch to dark mode. But I'll zoom in a little bit. We can see we have this automatic ripping machine dashboard here. And we can log in by just using the default, which is admin password. And we'll start by going to settings here. Hopefully we should see both of our 2 disk drives. If you don't, you can hit scan for drives, and if they still don't pop up, then you'll need to figure out why that's not working. But we have both of our disk drives here. In fact, I can actually, don't know if you'd hear that. Yeah, I can actually control the disk drives remotely, which is handy. But yeah, we have our ARM dashboard, and we could start ripping something, but we would run into one issue right away because we don't actually have an API key to look up whatever the title is of whatever DVD or Blu-ray you put in there. And so if we go to settings here, we can go to Ripper settings, and if we scroll all the way down, we can see there's this OMDB API key, which by default, this is the API that it uses to look up titles. And we don't have an API key here, which we will need. Now, if you're only doing movies, you could use the movie database API, but if you want to do shows as well, you'll have to use this OMDB API. And so that's fairly easy to set up. If you go to the website, you can come up here to where it says API key, and you can request a free API key for, you only get 1,000 daily uses. And I tried doing this, and I couldn't get it to work. I only tried once, so I didn't try too hard, but I thought this was a cool thing that I was fine with supporting. So I actually became a patron on their Patreon, and from there I was able to get an API key. And then once you have that, you can just paste it into the settings. However, as far as I can tell, you're supposed to be able to use this settings window to just paste this in and hit submit, but I can never get that to work. So instead, we're just gonna hop over to the terminal again. And now we can actually go to nano, our config folder, and then this arm.yaml. And this is that same config. And if we go all the way down to the bottom, we have where we can submit our API key. So I'm just going to type that in there and then save this file. And then we can just run docker restart arm rippers, hit enter. And then if we go back to our settings, that API key should now be there. So we can start ripping. So I'm just gonna start with something simple. I have this DVD for The Road to El Dorado. I'm gonna pop this in. All right, we'll give this just a second, but oh, there it is. You can see right here, we have The Road to El Dorado. It popped up, and the scaling is a little janky here, but if we click on this, we can actually see some of the information. It was able to find it with the API, and it's currently scanning to see what titles are on here. All right, so that one worked pretty well, but what if we try a different movie, like The Emperor's New Groove? All right, so I popped in The Emperor's New Groove, but as you can see, we have The Centuries of the Emperors, 1971 through 1973. And this is actually a TV series because, well, this OMDB is not extremely accurate. So what I can fortunately do is go to title search. I can just get rid of the year, and I can just type in Emperors, hit search, and we can see right here, there's The Emperor's New Groove, movie 2000, update title, and now the title's updated, and this should work properly. But that kind of brings me to some of the things that don't work super well with Automated Ripping Machine. There are definitely times where the database just doesn't work. It doesn't pull up the right title. And sometimes, like with The Emperor's New Groove, it thought it was a series, which can really mess things up if you're not paying attention. Another thing that can kind of be an issue is, well, for example, if we hop into this Road to El Dorado, if we hop down here, we can see these are the actual files on here that it's going to rip. And we can see, well, there's not just one, because when you're ripping DVDs and Blu-rays, it's rare that there's just one big media file on there. There's usually a lot of little files. We have what probably looks like the main feature because it's the longest thing, but there's these other files here that, well, it's going to rip and transcode, and we may not need those. Now, this probably isn't a huge deal with DVDs because the files are so small and the ripping and transcoding is going to be pretty fast, but things can get a little worse if you're dealing with some Blu-rays, like this copy of Up, for example, where it ripped like 4 different copies of the movie for like 4 different languages. And had I not stepped in, well, it's going to rip all 4 of those and transcode all 4 of those, which really makes the process take quite a bit longer. Now, there are a few ways around this. One is to enable something called main feature. And basically what that does is instead of ripping all of the individual files and then transcoding them all, it'll pull everything off of the disk and then let Handbrake use its main feature tool to try to decide what the main feature file is and only rip and transcode that. So if you want to use that, you can enable it by going to the edit settings every time you put a new disk in, or you can go into the config file, the arm.yaml, and find where it says main feature and change this to true, which means by default that main feature thing will be checked. Now here it says you have to set up this rip method equals backup for Blu-ray discs, which is in the make MKV section of this config, but that didn't seem to be the case for me. I never enabled that. I never changed it from the default MKV method, and this main feature thing still seemed to work. So the main feature tool is one that can help you save space and save time by only transcoding that main feature file, but sometimes it doesn't work. I actually had a couple of movies where I think there was like a 16:9 version and a 4:3 version, and the handbrake tool couldn't decide which one to use, so it ended up just failing. So then I had to start over, make sure the main feature was disabled, and then it would work. So it's a little bit hit or miss. Now the other way of solving which files to pull is to do it manually. So if you go into the settings and you find where our disk drives are, you can change these from drive mode auto to drive mode manual. Unfortunately, you can do this per drive. It's not a global setting, so you could have like a drive for movies and a drive for shows. Because for shows, it's really common for like a season of a show on a DVD to have a file for each episode, but then also to have a massive file that's just all the episodes all back to back, which would be like the play all feature in the menu. And so you probably want to have this manual setting turned on so that when you put the disk in, it will look and find all the files that are on the disk, and then you can just manually select which ones to rip and transcode. Now to do that, as I said, you'll have to go into the drive settings and set the drive to manual mode, and then hit update to save those settings. And then back on this main dashboard, whenever you put the disk in, you'll have 30 minutes, I believe, after it scans everything to come in here and check which ones you want, and then you can hit update. And then after that, it'll pull all the stuff you tell it to and nothing else. I'll try to show you that here in a second. But yeah, another issue I had was I was ripping a season of Parks and Rec. The disk went in, it ripped everything, it kicked the disk out automatically, which it does, which is helpful. That way you know when it's done, you can go grab the disk and whatnot. But then it just re-injected again. And there's supposed to be an avoid duplicates feature that happens, but well, as you can see here, that didn't happen, and it just kept ripping this disk and putting all like 9 of those files in a new folder, and then transcoding them all, and then kicking the disk out and kicking it back in, and then ripping all the media off, transcoding it again, kicking it back out, kicking it back in, and just kept going. And like I said, there's supposed to be this auto duplicates feature, but I think it's based off of the name of the folder, but sometimes it renames the folder with like a bunch of random characters at the end, so there aren't duplicates. It's weird. Sometimes the duplicate thing works, sometimes it doesn't, and it seems odd. I feel like it could be pretty easy to implement this in a way. Here, I'll show you. If I go into the logs here and I go find this Road to El Dorado and I just do the full log, you can see early on, it identifies this disk hash here, this DVD CRC4 hash. And this was actually used, I think, to look up the title with a different database that actually seemed to work better because it based it off of the hash of the disk. So it was a lot more accurate, but I think that database was run by like Microsoft or something, and it no longer works. So they had to switch over to the OMDP database, which is why it's a little bit more hit or miss. But anyway, it does pull this hash still. And so to me, I feel like it would make sense if they implemented some sort of feature to where if there was a job that had the same hash within the last X amount of jobs, that it would say, oh, that's a duplicate, it got re-injected, we'll make sure we don't read that. But it didn't, so I just kept getting all of these copies of the show. So be careful if you have it set up to auto-eject. If your disk drive is like mine, where it seems to just, after a minute or two, kick itself back in, you might end up with this issue where it just keeps ripping everything off and backing up all your transcode jobs. Oh, hey, one of our disks is done. So that's one of the features I kind of hinted at, but one thing that's kind of cool is whenever it's done ripping everything off, it will kick the disk out and you can put another disk in and start ripping something, but it actually isn't completely finished. If we go back to our homepage, we can see this Road to El Dorado is now in the transcode process. So it ripped all the files off, it's now transcoding it to a preset in Handbrake, and the disk is out, and we can actually throw something else in. I'll actually take this as an opportunity to show the manual mode. So if we go to settings, we can go to our DVD drive, which is this one right here, and we'll change the drive mode to manual. We'll hit update. Now I'm gonna put in this Parks and Rec Season 2 disc. So that's in there now, and you can actually see this is kind of cool. We only have 2 disk drives, but we actually have 3 jobs currently running, and we can actually make that 4, because I'm also gonna toss in a Blu-ray really quick. All right, cool. And now you can actually see we have 4 jobs going. This one didn't seem to find the title. We can just go to title search. I'm just gonna do up. No idea why that's not working. See, like I said, there can be some quirks. So we can go to custom title, and we're just gonna call it up with year 2009. Oh, we can also go to edit settings. I'm gonna do this main feature option, and I'm gonna change the disk type to Blu-ray. Hit submit. It doesn't give me any feedback here. The UI can be a little, there's feedback here once I get back to the dashboard that it's submitted, but yeah, it's kind of odd. We can do the title, but we can't tell it that it's a movie. And so it's gonna put it in this undefined folder once it's done, so that we have to manually move that over to the movies. It's a little odd. It's a little irritating. There's a lot of things about the UI that are a bit irritating. Oh, and that reminds me, I wanna be really clear. I always feel a little bit awkward being critical of open source software that's being developed by people for free. I think it's amazing that they're doing this project, but if I'm making a video potentially showing people how to use this, I want them to be aware of what they're getting into and what some of the current issues and downsides are. But even with some of the issues, you can start to see how effective this can be. You can see with just like even 2 disk drives, you can be ripping and simultaneously transcoding like 3, 4, 5, 6 things at a time. Oh, actually, we just got a notification here. If we head over to Parks and Rec, it's waiting 30 minutes for us to pick the titles. And so we don't get a ton of information here, but we can at least get the runtime. Looks like there's 8 of these that pretty much all have the same runtime. And if we look in the case, we can see there's actually 7 episodes, so this would make sense. What we can do is we can say we want these. I don't want this big file because that's probably all 7 episodes just in one big video file, so we don't want that. And then these are probably like bonuses, deleted scenes, commentary, stuff like that. So we just want the main videos here, and we can hit update. And this is final. Once you hit update, you can't go back. So we'll hit update. And now it's going to start processing all of those, but just the files that we picked. Overall, it's working decently well. I will say the UI is not the best. It is pretty awkward and kind of janky sometimes, but it at least gets the job done for the most part. Movies, whenever the database works and the main feature option works pretty well. Movies are pretty straightforward. It's pretty seamless. TV shows take a little bit of manual work, but it's still less manual work than what you would be dealing with if you were just running Make MKV on your own. Oh yeah, we've actually had one of our videos complete. The Emperor's New Groove is done. So if we go to the media and completed folder, and then movies, we have a folder for the Emperor's New Groove. And if we click on here, we have our finished MKV, and it works. You can also see in these folders, we have our raw folder, for example, The Road to El Dorado. This is where the raw files live. And then as it's being transcoded, it's going here. And then once it's done, then it ends up in a nice pretty folder in the completed side of things. Now, one thing you might have noticed, and I kind of mentioned earlier, was that down here where it says hardware transcoding support, it says that Intel QuickSync is supported. And that's because it recognizes that we have an Intel i7-9700, which has integrated graphics and can technically support QuickSync. But, well, by default, the Docker container doesn't have all of the drivers and packages you need to actually use QuickSync. This would work with QuickSync if you manually installed all of those packages, but with Docker, it doesn't, and there's not an official way to fix that. Now, fortunately, I found this custom Docker file from Polsklkurl. I have no idea how to say that, I'm so sorry. But basically, he set up a Docker file that uses the original ARM container image and sets it up so that it installs all of the necessary packages and stuff to get QuickSync running. So I just copied his Docker file right here, and so I can do docker build-t, and we're just going to call this ARM-QSV, and we can build this custom Docker image that's the exact same image as the ARM image we were already using, but it does come with the support for QuickSync. All right, that took quite some time to get that ready, but now if we type in Docker images, and now if we type in Docker images, we can see we have our automatic ripping machine image, but we also have this custom image, this ARM-QSV. So now we can go back to this command we had earlier, but we're going to edit just a couple of things. We can keep everything the same, but for the final image, we're just going to change this to ARM-QSV. And then we also need to pass through the integrated graphics. And then now, sadly, even though we have some things running, I'm going to stop this Docker container and then remove it. And then we can restart our new Docker container by just rerunning that start ARM file. And then now if we hop back into the web dashboard, we're here. These say they're still running. I'm pretty sure based off of my past experience testing this, they're going to fail here in a bit, but oh well. All right, so we have this container running. It technically supports QuickSync, but if we just run things as is, it's not actually going to use QuickSync because if we look in the config under Handbrake preset for DVD, we have this HQ 720p surround, and then for Blu-rays, we have this HQ 1080p surround. So we're going to need to change those. So once again, we can just go in and change our config. And here for the DVD preset, I'm just going to use this H.265 QSV 1080p. And then for the Blu-ray, I'm going to use this 4K preset. And then if we saved it like this, it would work, but I'm not a big fan of the default quality settings on those profiles. So what we can actually do is go down here to the additional arguments for DVD. We're going to add quality equals 18 and encoder preset equals quality. And then for the Blu-ray option, we'll also add quality equals 22 and encoder preset equals quality. Now you can look up the Handbrake documentation and decide these settings on your own, but this is what worked for me and gave me better speed because I was using hardware accelerated transcoding and it was more efficient, but the quality wasn't just terrible. All right, so now we should be able to save this and then we can just restart our container. And then I just dropped in this Lost Empire of Atlantis DVD, which should pop up here in a second. And once this rips, we should see that we're actually going to get hardware accelerated transcoding working, and it's going to be quite a bit faster and quite a bit more efficient. All right, so that rip actually finished entirely. If we go to the database tab here, and if we look at the logs, and we'll see once we hit Handbrake, we start encoding here. And we can see we were actually getting like in the high 200s, nearly 300 frames per second, over 300 frames per second at times, which makes sense for Intel integrated graphics with DVD quality videos. If you get up to like 4K Blu-rays, that encoding time, in my experience at least, was closer to like 24 frames per second with this i7-9700, but still much faster than if we're trying to do it with software. And if we watch this, it's DVD quality, so it wasn't great to start with, but you know, it's fine. To give you a better idea, this up file here was also transcoded using the same settings, and this is 1080p. It still looks pretty decent. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Everything's working with hardware accelerated transcoding, but well, how would you implement this into a like home lab setup or something? Well, like I said earlier, there's quite a few ways. You could take exactly what I did and install this in like TrueNAS Scale or in Unraid, and there's actually documentation you can go find on the Unraid forums, people who have gotten this set up and worked out some of the quirks with like permissions and such. But I actually went a different route, and I actually installed Proxmox on this system, and let me hop over to that really quick. All right, so I've rebooted the system. I just swapped out the SSD with an SSD that has Proxmox installed, and I also hooked up those two hard drives that I mentioned earlier because, well, I hadn't been using them up until now, but I did use them in Proxmox. So here in Proxmox, you can see I have a few things running. First of all, I have this TrueNAS VM, which I passed through the two hard drives to via just passing through the SATA controller. And here I have this pool with 4 terabytes of usable space, and I have my shares set up and everything. And then I also have Jellyfin running in an LXC container. And if I hop into that, you can see that under mount, I have this Jelly folder mounted, which is just a shared folder mounted from the TrueNAS VM. And then for ARM, well, looking back on it, I probably could have just run it in this TrueNAS VM if I wanted to, but if I ran it in a Docker container inside a VM, I wouldn't be able to use hardware accelerated transcoding unless I just tried to pass through the entire integrated graphics, which is a huge pain, and then that means Jellyfin can't use it. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna try to run it in an LXC container. And so that's what I tried to do here. You can see even in the LXC configuration, I tried passing through the 2 DVD drives and a few other things to try to get UDEV working, but I kept running into this error with UDEV for some reason, and that caused issues with ARM. So that was kind of a pain. So instead, I just set up a VM with Ubuntu server and then basically configured ARM exactly like I did in the last setup. I just didn't enable hardware accelerated transcoding because I don't have a GPU to pass through. What I did pass through though was the SATA controller because, well, since I had already passed the hard drives through to TrueNAS, I needed a way to pass through the DVD drives to my VM for ARM. And so I just used this cheap little dual SATA controller for that. If I look at the folder structure here, it's basically the same. But if you look in the FS tab, you can actually see I mounted this share from my TrueNAS server to this folder at /home/arm/completed. And so, for example, if we list completed and then movies, we can see we have this Atlantis: The Lost Empire right here, this folder for it. And then because in Jellyfin it's mounted to the exact same share, it can pull that movie and we can watch Atlantis. So essentially that's how you would incorporate this into any sort of home lab setup where you're also running Jellyfin or Plex and you may have a NAS setup. Basically, you just have to make sure that the completed folder is mounted to where your Jellyfin or Plex server can access it. And then essentially it just drops the finished movies or shows in the correct folders with the correct names, hopefully, into the folder where Jellyfin or Plex can find it. And that's how it works. Like I said, it's not perfect. If you're really hoping that this would be a process where you can completely forget about it and never have to touch it, it's just not going to be the case. That being said, compared to manually ripping everything with MakeMKV, manually transcoding it all, this is still way faster in my opinion and can definitely speed up the process. So I'm actually going to be leaving this system put together for a bit because, well, I actually have quite a few DVDs and Blu-rays that we've just never ripped because I didn't have a good setup. So I could sit down on a Saturday afternoon and, I don't know, play some Baldur's Gate and kind of in the meantime, just drop in a few Blu-rays and DVDs and just sort of monitor it and make tweaks as needed. And it still does a lot of the work in the background, which is really helpful. So it's a little bit hit or miss. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a useful tool if you're a person with a big media library and you're looking for a relatively quick and easy way to rip that and get it ingested into your media library. Hopefully you guys enjoyed taking a look at the automatic ripping machine. I really hope they continue to develop this and make improvements. As is though, it's still pretty cool, so shout out to all the developers who have helped make this happen. I think that's about it for this one though, so as always, thank you guys so much for watching, stay curious, and I really can't wait to see you in the next one.